I want to welcome Pekko Koskinen from the Economic Space Agency. Hi, Pekko. Really good to see you.
Hello.
How are you?
I actually see. Well, it's always the most complicated question in the world. Like
I know.
Should try to somehow be comprise something that is very large into a very small comment. I think this is why people give up and just say that they're good and hope for that there are no other questions. So I'll do the same, just for this moment.
Very good. But you're here. That's already that's good. And I look forward to our conversation, Pekko. So I know that you are a person that has one leg into, or one passion into, game design. This is something that also that accompanied your work over the past years, not only within the Economic Space Agency, but also together with cultural platforms you have been part of. It's something that for you is an important driver and also an instrument for sense making and for understanding how the world works. But then you also, secondly, you have this great passion for organizational design. And I remember from a previous conversation that org design for you is almost an art form in itself, right? So for today, you have planned to combine like these two major passions of yourself, organizational design and game design, to look into the possibility of building organizations on top of game design and experiments. In short, X-orgs, right?
Yes. Yeah, on that topic of culture, from culture to organizations, I could say, first of all, that I think organizations are actually constitutional to culture. That is, like, well, if we would remove all the organization, and of course, that would not only comprise something like corporations, foundations, charities, corps, but also nations, which are organizations just on a more larger and more complex scale, we would not have much of a culture that we know as of now. So in terms of like building frameworks, woodworks for culture, organization is a key concept, and what kind of organizations we can build is culturally crucial, you could say. So even for that reason, like we are here, like I think at the edge of a very central cultural question. But how do we want to take this? So we have material, of course. We are open to questions as well, but how do we do the start, or how do we want to start?
Pekko, I thought it would be great if you could. Did you prepare a presentation or anything? Yeah, I think first of all we should get people into your mode of thinking, right? And let's tune everyone in. So I want to invite everybody watching this stream. Sit down, have a coffee, listen to Pekko's thoughts. It's going to be interesting. And then we can discuss about it. So I have our website with a chat in front of me, right? So I'm going to monitor that chat. Let's see what people come up with. Ask me anything. I'm happy to relay those questions to Pekko. And I will just help moderating the session a little bit, passing on some prompts here and there. And for now, I would just kindly ask you, Pekko, to kick it off with a presentation.
All right, let's do that. So let's start with the start, or pre-start. That is introductions. So in terms of Xorg, we could start first with people that are here, that are connected in various ways to this, let's say, very new initiative, is I guess a good word. I would say it's maybe a month and a half old, but it's also has longer roots. So it's not starting from nothing this year, but rather came from a longer research in the context of EXA particularly, towards organization, which has been running for 4 or 5 years, depending on where you draw the line. So there is a lot of background to it, but the XORG is an initiative, and you can first start by people that are here. There are more, and we'll might hear from some of them as well if we in the later parts. But for now, so let's do some introductions. First, me shortly. Like I have a complicated background, as Ella referred. There is culture, something that could be called arts, or has been kind of sanctified to the hallowed halls of art in some situations, which is often really a question of sanctification. But I do think like the game and game structures in the widest sense possible, also considering social life and its rules and conventions, which are, I think, equally important rule-like things, are for me game-like, or rather, I would say, games are one of the mediums, one of the approaches that we have that can turn the social situation into a creative one. That is, like, if we are even on the street, if we set certain rules, we have a possibility of creating a situation that is changed from the social. So it's almost like opening a creative palette on the side of the life in itself. And this is, of course, not just street, but really any social situation, also organization as well. Beyond that, like, there are many points I could make, but maybe I'll say that you can take anything I say here as a kind of an introduction to me. So I think that's enough. In addition, we have here our occasional partaker from whom you heard already, if you were in earlier sessions on Friday, the blockchain socialist, and I'll just let him freely introduce himself as well.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. I'm the blockchain socialist. It's a pseudonym, and the name of the platform that I made about a year and a half ago. It started off as a blog where I shared my thoughts on the blockchain space from a left-wing perspective, and then I've sort of now transitioned more into podcasts. And out of the creation of that platform, there was also a creation of a community of people, including people who were already working in the blockchain space, or who were just interested in technology and wanted to find and explore ways for more progressive means as opposed to the traditional sort of conservative economic takes that a lot of blockchain projects that you have. And so out of that, I got to know quite a few very cool people, including Ari, who's in the call right now. But we sort of came together and decided to create a type of response to the tendency of right-wing sort of assumptions about economy and economics in the blockchain space, and sort of create a response to that. So that's when we created the Bread Chain project I presented to in the first day. So you can find that presentation in the Discord that I shared. But yeah, so in the context of game and the discussion today, that's probably the focus is going to be, for me, I guess, thinking about how we would organize such a thing, such a left-wing response to the blockchain sort of organization question, and whether or not there is a possibility for some sort of more progressive vision in terms of organization, as opposed to the more free market-based ones that we commonly see in blockchain.
Thank you so much, blockchain socialist, for joining us. Can I ask you, just for a little bit of clarification, what do you think is not working with the prevailing vision of blockchain? What is it that you feel needs a widened perspective? And what is the void that the more left blockchain community can fill?
Yeah, there's a lot. Huh? But I guess one of the most, I think, glaring ones, or the most obvious ones, is like around governance. I think a lot of the projects, they rely on they rely on the market to distribute the right to govern a particular project. I think probably 99% of the projects, if they have some sort of governance mechanism, it's through some sort of token that you can freely buy on the market. And that token gives you a right to vote on proposals or do particular things. And in that way, leaving it up to sort of the movements of the market and allowing already prevailing inequalities in the world to also take advantage. It means that people with a lot of means, commonly known in the crypto space as whales, but really, I think, more maybe Marxist sense, it's sort of like the capitalist in a way. They own the capital. They're able to have significantly more influence over projects than do maybe the people who have volunteered their time to actually work on the project and who don't have as much money and are more maybe vested in it through their labor rather than through their capital. So I think that's a very glaring one. And
thanks for the clarification. I think that helps a lot to kick off the debate, so people get a better understanding of what it actually is that you want to tackle here. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks.
Ari, do you want to do a short introduction for yourself since you're bravely here? So it would be nice to give a room for everybody, including you.
Sure. Yeah, super brief. I'm basically a blockchain developer person, a cryptographer, and a software developer who has always been interested in using my skills to do more interesting things than just work for companies and help them build their free market enterprises and make money, which I've been doing for a few years, which is great. But I feel like in the process, the tools that I learned building on Ethereum, they feel so powerful that I want to sort of bring that to any other communities, to be honest, that might be able to wield them besides just the ones I've already worked with. And so I found the Blockchain Socialist online, and that's sort of one of the places where I started doing that. And so we've been working together, and my goal is always basically to just kind of see if I can take this fire of the of what I feel, this power that I feel is being able to work on smart contracts and all of the abilities that gives you, and see if I can sort of hand that over to other people who can make use of it.
Thank you.
All right. So let's start from the start in terms of the presentation.
Okay. Pekko, can you share your screen?
I will share my screen in a moment. But I'll start with the things that I don't have a particular image for. So I'll share it immediately when I have something to show. But for start, I'll put in the chat an invitation to the Xorg Telegram, and use that to start talking about Xorg and what's the basic idea. Like I said, it's a very young group with a longer background, but what's the idea? So Xorg, you could say, in two principles, is using game design as organizational design, which comprises a lot of translation of structures in games into something that is usable for organizations. Secondly, you could say that it's a group about playing organizations into existence. That is, it's not just designing, but also creating these sort of forms of experimentation where you can have, let's say, even in 10 minutes from some rules, you're capable of entering into a moment inside an organization, let's say in a speculative sense, which might be even a live moment, but also can really be about testing the rules or form and conventions of the organization itself. I would also say that it's not a group that is going to be owned by anyone. So even though it has started in the confines of EXA, the point is, like, if EXA is a harbor, XORG is something like a ship sailing from there. And the reason for this is, well, bluntly, you could say this is open sourcing, but like with a little bit more detail. The idea is to try to form this sort of advocacy group for literacy of organizations. The game approach is central, but also not some kind of sacrosanct that everything has to be games. But like underneath there, games are seen as a tool to explore unusual alien forms of organizations that don't yet exist. And while saying that, I could say that it's not against something like finding an optimum, but it is against the mindset that it's about finding the one solution. It's not trying to say that let's find the one solution like quadratic voting for all the decision interactions, but rather widening the palette of what kind of forms and interactions we can have. Because every one of these, like voting, is an interaction. Like if you add a discussion before the vote, even if the voting form stays the same, it's actually a different interaction. If you add comments to the votes, it's a different interaction again, and so on and so forth. This is about kind of acknowledging diversity, because diversity is really key for literacy, like awareness of diversity of structures. So to put it in a nutshell, like we're trying to avoid this, that a group is about sessions where everybody's trying to lure each other into their projects. That's, of course, possible that you're interesting. People might join you. But it's really like any group coming there and saying like, hey, we've been thinking about or testing or designing for our organization this kind of decision method or this kind of membership, etc. What do you think of it? Or do you have any experiences, etc., etc.? To create processes of where we expand and widen this sort of sense of structural library, so to speak. And of course, it is about finding ways to give those forms to people, and games are possible here as well. And something that we're looking at first, which is like a game is a form actually where you can put any rule of an organization, but you have like maybe more forms of representation, which is a topic we'll visit a lot today. But it's of course not limited to games. Again, like if one wants to present them in other forms, that's completely fine in itself. So that's a very summary description of XORG and its aims, you could say. But we could start first going into, let's say, the reasoning of why XORG should exist, to my mind at least. First, from a short look on the sense of organization, particularly in crypto, but also around it. There's let's say not just crypto, but like in this new field that is meeting organization, economy, and governance, and how one could kind of open it up a bit to lay the groundwork towards the XORG. So towards this, first of all, we have these concepts like we have economy, we have governance, we have organization. In my sense, I would say that ultimately it is not useful to separate economy and governance. And this is why we need something that unites them two and sees them as collaborating as a form, or through kind of entwined forms. An organization is maybe the best candidate we have in our culture, unless we want to make new concepts. But it's also maybe, for me, a useful place for the concept of organization, therefore, that I think is applicable. But so, of course, that's an argument to say economy and governance are essentially two sides of the same coin, to put slightly punish, but not really a pun combination for it. but how to put some meat on that argument in itself is like, if we actually look at the forms that we call economy and the forms that we call governance, the closer we look or deeper we look underneath, the less separation there appears. First example, if we think of something that is naturally thought of as governance, for example, a Congress of a nation XYZ, you could say that almost all the decisions, like you could put a percent over 90%, whatever, of that Congress are actually economic. That is, if we going to pay the hospital this and that, or are we going to divide the budget in this manner and that manner, are actually economical decisions. But of course, they include elements of governance. Sorry, practical point. Ella, I can hear you. Yeah. So maybe muting. So if one is making decisions about hospitals, that is an economic investment run by governance, both from the Congress itself, but in the move, what happens with these hospitals, what happens with the buildings, the governance cascades down. And without the governance, there is no economy. And without the economy, the governance move is moot, empty. Secondly, to take another perspective towards this, if you look at something like coins and tokens, currencies, fiat currencies also included, going underneath them, let's say also stocks, if we take a stock, for example, which is a unit that can function in a semi-token-like fashion, and of course some of the cryptos that actually resemble those in various fashions. If one is to remove all the interactions, that is all the exchanges, you're still holding the stock, but it has no practical value because there's the only value that it gets are the actual organizations of interaction that it has. So in this sense, organization is once again constitutional to the value of the stock. And of course, if you look at any token, let's say something like Bitcoin, Bitcoin is nothing without the rules, almost like a board game that runs from miners, but also extraneous rules, which are exchanges, etc., that allow you to interact with it. And once again, remove all of those organizations, their governance. Bitcoin is an empty object. So Bitcoin, and we could do the same for Ethereum or really any other token, is an empty vessel. It's almost like a reflection. And even their values are more dependent on the organizations themselves. So these are examples what I mean by entwined structures, and how governance and economy are entwined concepts. And when you're designing economy, you're unavoidably designing governance. And therefore, the organization can be a word where we actually acknowledge this from the get-go, that some design, some structure might seem economical, another one might seem governance. But ultimately, actually, both are needed, inevitably, for either to work. And this is one of the key factors I would lay in the beginning. A short comment on why this is so. I think that this is why this sort of like separation. I think it's of course cultural and historical, but it's also because the intricate interweavings are on the deeper level. That is, like, why tokens seem so important, even though tokens are actually not the place that constitutes the value. That is rather the organization that, say, offers an exchange for it. That's where the actual value happens. But we can see a similar example in, say, humans using machines with buttons. If they don't know the machine, if it's a complete mystery to them, they will start to think that the buttons do the things. But of course, the buttons are just linked to the machine, and the machine is actually the thing that creates the actual interaction. So in some ways, like tokens are really like buttons on a machine. Furthermore, one more perspective towards this. Now, there is, of course, a concept of DAOs. In some ways, a kind of like a weirdly wonky conceptual development that has kind of formed into a hybrid that is semi-undefined and maybe is easy to use for that reason. To give an example, like the Ethereum white paper, how it defines DAO would define that almost none of the DAOs are DAOs, because it makes a litmus test that if you have to use natural language that a computer wouldn't understand, not an AI, but just like a bot in itself, then it's not a DAO. It's not autonomous. And of course, like most of the DAOs are dependent on that. And we have created this sort of loose sense of what the DAO is. But beyond that, beyond its kind of popular use, I would note that even behind DAO, there is this search for one solution. That what is the future organization, and somehow it should happen only around DAOs. And I would contrast to that if you look at the old physical world and its coding of law and rules that creates organizations, in there, we have come to the practical realization that we cannot just have, one form. Like corporation serves certain needs, but not everybody wants to make a corporation because co-op has different emphasis. And then we have trusts, and then we have foundations, etc., etc. And if you go lower level, like associations, etc., we see a yet wider palette of forms. And there is no really drive to say these should all be one form. Why? Because all cultural forms, we could do the same case for literature, tend to branch out. And those branchings tend to form different strengths and weaknesses. And those different strengths and weaknesses offer us options of form. Now, is it really the case then that in the wide world of the digital, where we have vastly more capability of structuring than, say, law, we're only concentrating on one concept? Or are we simply maturing towards the situation where we recognize that it's actually about the diversity yet to be? And that organizational diversity is a key perspective, which I think entails a different mindset.
Pekko, I just want to jump in. Thank you so much for this really expansive contextualization. I'm not entirely sure whether there is still time to show a presentation on top, because we have almost reached like the first half of the session. And I just want to make sure that we also get a little bit into a dialogue, and that we can also pick up on questions we get from the chat. So I want to encourage everyone, those of you who listen, because this is quite complex territory we are charting here, feel free to ask any questions. We have 3 speakers here in this session that are absolutely equipped to answer and come up with, I think, really interesting thoughts. What Pekko just did was to give us to provide the cornerstones around this process of actually starting to build organizations like that. So for us, it was a reminder what it actually is to bear in mind before we start doing the actual work. I have a question here in the chat, and it seems to me quite relevant, because very often we take for granted that if you talk about the economy, that we all have the same understanding of what it is. But there's a very good question here asking how you define economy against the backdrop of what you have just presented us. What is economy for you? And you can also feel free to pass on the question to the blockchain socialists, for instance, to just to give us a glimpse of what's the backdrop of all this this theory? What is economy for you?
So economy in itself actually has many definitions, and there's no really settled sense of it. I mean, of course, you can get Wikipedia definitions, etc. But the deeper you go, once again, you find much more discordant sense of structuring. For me, like economy is an organizational emphasis, just like governance is another kind of emphasis. It emphasizes offer relations rather than command relations. That is, it like in a traditional governance structure, we really see mostly like somebody having the right to command others. And of course, horizontality is simply like using the command relation almost like a degree. It's taking that to zero, but it's still functioning in the same paradigm. And the economist paradigm of a relation, like an edge in a graph, is rather an offer. That is, you set the conditions, but you don't force the others, but rather so much offer that as an option in itself. Mm-hmm. There are other functions in itself, but that's a good example of how economy emphasizes structuring in an organizational manner differently than say traditional governance. But I do think these concepts will change. We are at the time that these concepts will change, and I do think we actually should redefine how do we see economy, and this is a kind of a starting point. But in terms of the presentation, I think yes, we'll start with that, because it's not gonna. The idea is not to run it all through the hour, but now that we get to the topic of games and why we picked the games with that kind of background, those perspectives outlaid as a kind of a platform to build upon, let's look at the games as then a topic. So first of all, what do we mean by the word games? We mean the games in the widest sense. Like, people know video games, but of course there are role-playing games, board games, live role-playing games, and the many different smaller forms, which is story games. We have game poems, etc., etc. Like, I picked this picture as a starter, which is a flash mob. But flash mob, of course, here a pillow fight is a set of rules. You could think of it as children's play, but children's play is kind of in the same continuum of game. Here, the game rules are changing the social situation. Similarly, if we go to something like LARPs, these are heavily related to, for example, the flash mob. It is also a sense of rules set to a real-world environment, but in this case, not in all LARPs even, but in this case, it even has this sort of sense of fiction, a layer that kind of changes what the environment is. Beyond that, of course, tabletop role-playing games do something very similar to LARPs. Of course, are kind of existed, well, mostly you'd say existed before LARPs. But their medium is conversation. And while the role-playing might seem somehow farther off of organization, I think they are actually, maybe in an allegorical fashion, are maybe one of the closest, if not the closest game directly related to the organization. And this is one of the things that we'll touch upon several times. But the reason for this is conversation is one of our most crystallized processes. And organization, of course, takes different forms. People are moving, acting, somebody's coding. But it's all about the communication and how communication is structured. And role-playing, tabletop role-playing hones on that. It's only that. And for this reason, it's not a surprise that if we look at the very small edges of tabletop role-playing, we'll start to find forms that are almost already organizations in the manner. Now, I don't have much pictures of tabletop role-playing game because they mostly actually are not visually very appealing. It's mostly seeing people around some table with the rules in front of them, cryptically so, but and kind of making decisions. But I'll pick some examples in kind of more detailed fashion from the particular games in both telling and some pictorial examples. Examples like this. The representation of a role-playing game is often like a mixture of different mediums. It can actually use all mediums that you could think of. It's in the nature of games in as a whole. Like you can do a game on a visual form, text form, even just audio, whatever. But role-playing games particularly use this in a kind of almost improvisatory fashion. So here, for example, a map is one representation. Every room here has a text on the side, which actually kind of gives this sort of generative seed for the room. Now, the key point I want to highlight here is this seed likeness. That is something like a room here, like the first part, which is this storeroom indicated on the map, is then given this sort of small description, entities or agents there, but there is no exact script of what happens. It's merely a seed for the game master to bring it forth, and then the players to make it into a process which is every time different. This is an interesting structure which has many representational forms in such games. This is interesting for organizations, because organizations neither don't want to and even cannot know precisely what happens beforehand. So a seed structure that is meant to be an interesting fertile seed is something that is useful for organizations, but rarely thought of in that manner. That the representations of organizations are often rules, and then they are records of whatever happens. But this gives us one case of how this can start to open up. Suddenly, okay, what is a seed? We can actually see certain kind of seed-like senses to, let's say, the descriptions of the organizations or principles, those kind of functions like seeds, but they are often not thought of as such, but more like rule-like entities. So, but then continuing the representation, if you think of board games, now board games in and of themselves have functions from competition to cooperation, and various subforms underneath them. But they also kind of representationally are forming in every case a different representation. So even here, like a map, it is partly figural. It has a river, land, but it's also functional. That is, every piece of land separated there has a certain function. It has certain kind of traits, allowing for actions, etc. And then around it, there is another representation here, points, or a way to kind of track the game and how it's going. And then the cards themselves contain both representations, but rules to how to function in the game. Now, once again, if we open up from here, what is organizational representation? What could we learn from mediums that have a highly structural nature, but also highly figural nature, that use a centrality, like here the board, but also use distribution, like the cards have actually many similarities to tokens. And of course, even beyond that, there are tokens in the game, which here stand for points, buildings, etc. But the cards specifically are actually almost like NFTs or ERC 721s. That is, they're individualized tokens, that they have different functions in themselves. So looking at a normal board game, we're seeing not just almost everything that we currently see in crypto economies, but we are also seeing representationally many techniques that are not really considered. And the techniques here are not just for cosmetics, they are here for understanding as well. So once again, an expansion to, or start of an expansion, a road to walk towards in terms of expanding what an organization is. Of course, there is also modularity. That is, board games, here we see once again the centrality of the central map, which in itself has a modular board built from like underlying pieces with other modularity on top of it to build cities in itself. And then each player, the 4 players here, have their own subboards, which has a different subgame where they build their buildings for their own places, which in and of itself is formulated differently. So this is not just modularity of forms in a passive sense, but it's modularity of interactions. That is, the game subgames that the players play become integrally connected to the board itself, and whatever gets gained from the main board comes to the subboard. So in this sense, like if we study the modularity used in board games, which still are just dependent on paper and cardboard, we actually find highly varied takes on how to implement modularity and how to make it as a functional possibility for organizing the game. And of course, underlying here is the thought that in a way, we can always say that any game, for example, a board game like this, is an organization in itself. It's organizing people to actions. It's giving them rights. Just like an organization invites its members to a meeting, it's a protocol. Rights, again, rule-like structures. Of course, we don't necessarily see the game normally as an organization or organization as a game, but structurally they are so close that these translations from one form of thinking like, oh, how could we use this kind of representations? How could we use this kind of modularities? Is like only a matter of small elements of translation. And these forms also hybridize. So a card which actually generally often takes this role of a kind of an NFT, that is a highly distributable object with identity and on its own particular, this can become the board. Like in this case, like they can actually have a mode where they're moving around and being switched, but then they're laid on the table and they actually kind of solidify themselves to become the board, to become the house in this case. And these kind of hybrid interactions, once again, offer many possibilities that are somewhat present. In some cases, there's slotting of the tokens, etc. It's not completely away from there. But looking at it structurally, that, hey, this is a general approach. And then it has many, many forms. We can find more from games. And there's this whole vast library of different approaches from simply looking at how they function in these games with rules coming with them. Quite exact rules, especially in the case of board games. That opens for us the sort of possibility of mining that library, getting those forms into play. A final point on board games. Over this picture, for example, there is a constant conversation going, usually. Sometimes the conversation is simply kind of extra to the game, like over the table. But it can also, of course, be integral to the game if, for example, the players can offer something to trade or to discuss moves in a collaborative game. That's not separate. And this is also an interesting structure, of course, reflected in organizations, that you can have a protocol of voting and then you talk around that. But utilizing this approach is about to combine the discourse, the conversation, and the structures that it utilizes to set itself a kind of navigation point, and to map it itself to interactions, is yet another expansion of areas that we can utilize. So these are merely snapshots. I could go on, like I have hundreds of examples, but we won't go there because the point here is to open up why these possibilities are important, why this is offering us a mature library that has started from diversity and seeing itself creative and used thousands of years to create different forms, and how useful that can be for a form that is rather nascent like crypto economy, and which has kind of expanded its potential of creation, but hasn't matured its palette yet. So if, as I would argue with the cases underneath here, we can make these sort of small translations and convert, utilize, this in itself is a richness that is wholly undermined or underutilized, maybe is a better word for that. And these are one of the kind of underlying principles of why we think something like an XORG is useful as not just an advocacy in the abstract sense, but the practical, experimental mapping out and testing out this kind of library. Okay, that was a long enough stint. I think that gives a certain kind of sense of this sort of possibilities. Like I said, it's merely a fragment from one side of it. But Ella, if you have good comments, questions, I'm also ready for that. Otherwise, we can also move to a second perspective.
Well, no, I would really say let's open the discussion. It's super interesting. Thanks for giving us this overview, and I find it very fascinating that like your basic thesis that you are bringing across here. That but maybe it's my German perspective. I don't know that something as a board that has certain mechanisms inscribed, but also has this very strong component of chance, not change, but chance, right? In its very nature, that you take that as a starting point for organizational design, where basically everything is about avoiding things you can't control, at least in a classic manner. And of course, we have pretty much steered away from that by establishing agile organizational design and agile methodologies. But still, there's always a plan behind. So board games do have a very rigid setting, but they still have this component of chance. Things might happen. You might just be unlucky, right? And how do you integrate that into organizational design?
So, first of all, it's one doesn't necessarily take the main drive or the main paradigms of the board game, but because it's a very wide field. You find many fringe cases, interesting designs, maybe small ones, etc. And in that range, of course, not every one of them is rigid. Now, you can use the rigid structures also, because even inside an organization, there are rigid structures. For example, the voting in itself, it can have a discourse around it, but when it comes to voting, it's almost like a module, and that is extremely rigid. You have this time frame. You have one vote. These are your options. This is a board game. This is exactly in the same rigidness as a board game. And once we look at this sort of modularity of board games and look at these mechanisms, they are actually applicable to the organization as these skeletons that organizations actually require. So just in the case of voting, if I look at the kind of different auction forms and hidden and different communications and how you come with a vote or with your tokens, etc., there's already a wider variety, even in that range, than you have, say, what we have organizationally, mostly because they have kind of sense that their name of the game is diversity, is to show how your game is different from the others, and that has led to many different designs. Mm-hmm. But as an additional point, what I kind of foreshadowed earlier, we've been looking at role-playing games, and particularly, once again, the fringe of role-playing games, something called story games, and then a scene called Forge, which was around a Forge forum that around early 2000s that created many kind of experimental games in itself. So the interesting thing here is that when you go to role-playing games, the nature of the role-playing games is often much less rigid than the board games are.
Yeah.
So to use this time to also point to an example that XORG has already done as a test, we used a game called Universalis, which is this is cover of a book, and it's a very unknown one. It's like, I think it has sold maybe 1,000 copies altogether, around early 2000s in a couple of versions. But Universalis is a role-playing game that runs completely on tokens. They call them coins. That was before crypto, but nevertheless, we could think about that as a token structure.
Mm-hmm.
And it runs even in the sense of you create the world. You there is nothing in the beginning, just the tokens. And then there's a set of rules that actually set what is there. And its structure, to give an anecdote of why it's interesting, is that it makes a difference between conversation and fact. That is, it plays on the conversation between people, like saying there could be this in our world, I would like this, and so on. But any player with tokens can at any point say, okay, I place a token to, there is a river cutting through the main continent. And once they place the token there, it turns into a fact that it has resistance. If somebody else defines something for the world, they cannot just wipe away the fact that there is a river.
Mm.
Furthermore, do say.
Yeah, I think it's really fascinating. You know, all these different compounds that games actually have. Each of them offers a starting point. And I was just thinking that while listening to your presentation, and obviously it also has inspired other people, because here in the chat there is a question, and I think it's probably quite challenging to cover that in this really short period of time. But there's a person asking who would be really interested in like a walkthrough the different elements of games and their capacities, like maps, cards, tokens. And then also the notions of centrality, mobility, identity they bring along with them, right? So my question, and maybe we can include everyone here in the room. My question is, first of all, do you already have like a set of these elements that you would take as a starting point for real world organizational design?
Yes.
And if so, what are these? What are the ingredients? Where would you start with? And Pekko, maybe you can start, and then let's also invite the others to maybe draw on that. That would be nice.
Yeah, I'll just comprise and I'll give room for others. So yes, we have a set, and it would be nice to introduce it, but also we would be here for a few hours. And also to address these other topics, I think this is one of the reasons why we're doing snapshots of different elements in itself and talking fairly high level to kind of keep this session in a sensible frame. But yes, that set is actually kind of complicated. That it's easy to cover this sort of basic possibilities, but you also have to keep an eye on forms that kind of break them, because they are often the most interesting ones. But to say it shortly, yes, we have identity, how role is actually a more expanded concept of what we consider a member. And once we, for example, translate the game of a role or character, which is a form of a role in our terms, into as a tool set for building a membership or any kind of role, even the graphic designer is a role, and it's just kind of in a very limited fashion. So using these tools allows you to expand on each of these concepts. But yeah, like said, that is actually something that if you join the group, I'll repost the link to the Telegram later. It's in the beginning of the conversation. You will certainly get this kind of general rundown, and you can ask for that. But for now, let's say that it's something that is out of the realms of this presentation. Do others want to comment?
I would be interested actually to hear what Ari has to say about some of this in the context of blockchain and Ethereum, just because a lot of what you talk about in terms of the pieces of a game and like how a game is structured, like if you think of sort of the popular blockchain network platform Ethereum that's available, it has its own pieces and it has its own like parts that everybody sort of knows how to play with, and like that's how you interact with the actual blockchain in order to achieve something. And then you use like these particular data standards, like ERC, and then some numbers. So like ERC 721 is like an NFT data standard. And I feel like this idea of data standards maps fairly well to, I guess, the standards in a board game, like when you play particular games or particular pieces, and the rules in which you can use to achieve some sort of goal. So I'm curious to hear, in Ari's experience of playing with these type of pieces on the digital board game of Ethereum or something like that, how I don't know, just how his experience has been and how he's able to navigate that space. And it's also like it's like a very large board game where sometimes you don't even know what pieces you have to play with, but they're there somewhere out on the board game, but you just have to kind of look for it in the digital space or something like that.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah, I'll try to respond. I think there is a lot in this code layer, right? That can be done, and that's what I find so exciting about Ethereum is all of this. Because of these standards, there has been this explosion of activity and interoperation between applications. And so really just these very, very simple ERC standards like ERC 20 and ERC 721 and now 11552, just the basic token standards. The amount of innovation that can be done by just utilizing those and expanding on them is beyond what I ever would have imagined when I first learned about them. If you see, when I was first learning about how you could maybe make a token that was the ERC20, okay, that's cool. And all I could really imagine at first was, people making little vanity tokens and other very, very basic token structures. But now we have, tokens that wrap other things and have a lot of meaning, tokens that are on bonding curves, and so they actually are backed by other types of assets. And I mean, the world has really exploded in terms of this code layer and the amount of things we can do, and we still, I feel, are only on the tip of that iceberg. So yes, I think that this is a very, very important tool to play with, but I would still almost categorize it all as like one code layer, right? This is one piece is tokens and also smart contracts, right? And there's a lot that can be done with these, but there's obviously more, right? Like there's more pieces to the board game than just that, and just with a fancy smart contracts, you can do a number of things, and some things work, right? But it's a limited domain. For instance, at the very least, so the furthest we've gotten, at least with, the simple concept of lending and borrowing, is over collateralized loans because of some of the nature of the way the blockchain works and the way that it's supposed to have at least the ideologies there, where it wants to be completely trustless and permissionless. And also you don't need to know the identities of all the participants. This makes it almost impossible to even do something that's pretty normal to all of us, which is money lending that isn't over collateralized beforehand. Borrowing without having more money up front already locked up, right? And so this is just one show of how limited of what we can do if we only live on the smart contract level. And so then what are these other pieces, right, besides tokens that form the game of of a new model for economy and society. It's a very interesting question. I don't know I have the answer for, but there's definitely at least a few other pieces is all I would say. And that feels very clear to me. So tokens and smart contracts very powerful, but there's more.
I just want to jump in here. Thank you so much for all your answers, because there's also an interesting question here that I want to pass on to you, and it's also very practical. So someone is asking what other games like Universalis you would recommend as a good starting point for studying organizational design with gameplay. Are there any particular recommendations you want to pass on to people? We have 3 minutes left.
So let's use that also kind of to do a kind of wrap up. This is a microscope I would recommend. But the best recommendation I would give is join the Telegram group. Once again, link is in the beginning, but I'll post it at the end of the chat as well. Because many of these examples are not exactly your organization. It's almost like you get carrots, but you have to know how to cut them and cook them and to make them more pleasant. Well, people like raw carrots, but let's leave that aside in this example. So microscope is actually very interesting for one of the techniques which I would mention, which we have been developing in the group and even in EXA before that, which is called contouring. That it's actually highly logical in structure. This is a kind of summary of the microscope and all its mechanics, this picture from the book itself. But its logic actually allows for human interaction in the widest sense. So for example, it sets a task, like in the beginning of the game, it's like forming one sentence that describes the game to come, what it generates. Now, in terms of the people, they can shout about the name, you can decently have a conversation about the name, write it, whatever. The game doesn't really care, because the game only cares that you have this one sentence and then everybody agrees on it, and suddenly the logic can go forward. We can see that this combines the sort of thing that even a computer, even the simple one, simple logical of the code, can understand. Once this slot fills, once there's no rejections of that, the logic moves forward. Meanwhile, the actual process of producing that can be very free. So this is a concept called contouring, which I think is a key to recognize the sociality of the organization and the rules of organization and how to leave room for both. It's not just saying that logic is a limitation of sociality. It can in some ways even allow for it by combining these kind of structures. And microscope is a great case of studying such possibilities, because every one of its mechanics actually works like this. It leaves a lot of social space in itself. So to finalize, inside Xorg, we have done tests of precisely translating these games. The Universalis, we translated its world generation to organizational generation, which produced actually a kind of interesting network charter where people laid their tokens to say, this is important for me in this organization. But then that also allowed to turn those pieces laid out to become issuers. That is, those pieces that were laid out whenever the organization made a project could call upon the things kind of formed by the tokens to withdraw tokens that then pay for the project itself, etc. And we had a highly networked organizational form. That's not in Universalis, but that's something we have translated. Similarly, we made a test on microscope, but translating it yet again, because microscope is history, and that has a kind of progression of time. But we turned the structure into loop time, because organizations often work in loops, like, meeting every week, etc. So everything that was passage was turned into a loop of time, and the structure changed. And this created an interesting way of speculating about the possibilities of an organization, which we thought is highly useful, because organizations are often done for long term. And if you play 3 hours or 6 hours, having 2 sessions, and populate the area around your organization and create these small moments, because in Microsoft you can even create scenes, like in a speculative sense of what happens inside the organization. So in this sense, this allows you to see what are your actual availabilities, not just in the sense of a designer. So these are 2 good examples of the early cases we've been doing, and both of them are leading us to actually kind of generate our own versions. The originals don't work. But once again, maybe it's a good time to actually post the link again.
Yeah, Pekko, I have also just quickly, I have pasted the invite links to Xorg, both in the chat on our website and also on the Discord. Okay, so people have it, and I really want to encourage everybody because obviously now you have teased the appetite for more. That is sure. And I think we all agree that it's a really fascinating outlook. And I'm happy that we managed to cover like some of the basics. But I'm glad you put up the Telegram group, because that allows people to connect, to get in touch with you, and to help developing this concept further on. And ultimately, this is really something I hope will come up like a real... I don't know if it's a tool set or any sort of methodologies for real world implementation of what you have in mind here. I would definitely be interested in seeing that coming to life.
Yeah, it's about that. And it's also about art of organization, but it's also like answering the pressing need of populating or shedding light to this formal variety that surrounds us, but we are mostly unaware of. It's kind of like exploring that land and bringing those forms that one finds to share to the others. And if you're interested in that, because that variety is to come, we need that. So if you're interested, join the group. And also, like, I can definitely answer questions there, game examples, etc. They often come with some instructions or help, because they don't work as is. Like, these kind of game organizations don't yet exist, but we're making them to exist.
Okay, great. Hey, thank you so much, Pekko and Ari and the Blockchain Socialist, for joining us and for presenting this really fascinating overview on game design plus experiments equals a new way of developing organizations. Thank you so much. And I hope you'll stay with us for the rest of the afternoon. Bye-bye. Thanks.
Sure. Thanks.